This video accompanies the viewpoint chapter. In campus class, I use a couple of files to help my students understand where college is coming from and, of course, where our class is coming from. When we look at viewpoints, we use it as we begin the research part of the class. The class is called Writing and Research. It's not to say that you haven't done research before. We're trying to add to what you know already. And maybe you know all this, but we do think that there are a couple of things to lay the groundwork for the next steps of the class. So here they come. I showed this very unsophisticated word file when it comes to this chapter because I want people to know some vocabulary that's in it. And you might notice a theme in the vocabulary because viewpoints and studying them is about getting away from the viewpoints we've always had or the ones that have been most that have informed our youth and childhood up to where we are now, because there are so many out there. In fact, a famous educator and also poet, Matthew Arnold, in Britain said there's so much inviting us, and he was really talking about the different viewpoints that were out there, the different knowledge that was out there that we could discover. And that's the way that we treat viewpoints, not as something to shy away from, but as something to learn about. It's worth our time. After all, the word education comes from an older word, an older term meaning to bring out or lead forth, as if we're leaving a cave of darkness where all we can see are shadows on the walls to see the actual sun and the light that is casting those shadows. A great metaphor that Plato once used when thinking about how viewpoints get created, or how they grow, really. In looking at the new vocabulary, you can sense a theme because, as it says here, viewpoint is not all political. It really has to do with so many viewpoints in all different circumstances. We ought not to boil them down to just one or two, or if we mix our metaphor, to steamroller them out and flatten everything out. There are really more than two sides to anything. You have to explore which ones are the most reasonable ones to consider. And I had a prof in college who would always emphasize that there are 2.5 sides to every issue. And to that end, we want to learn what we can about it and not shy away from it. If our views are strong enough, they can withstand a little scrutiny and a little interrogation, after all. Anyway, the vocabulary list includes the word author, which used to come from authority. But I don't want to dwell on that too much right now. That'll have to deal with, that'll relate to when we get into actually researching sources. But the other words in the vocabulary, including egocentrism, ethnocentrism, religiocentrism, androcentrism, you can see definitions there, but they're all about being centered in kind of a narrow viewpoint and how we can think beyond just what the centrist viewpoints have us thinking about. In fact, in the chapter, one other word that she defines is propaganda and tyranny, the tyranny of having one viewpoint, where we simply repeat what we've been told. And I think most dramatically, probably in our chapter, we see that in one of the readings at the end of the actual chapter, though there are other occasions, when Alice Owens Johnson talks about her father, who, just as a doctor, as she says, would never tolerate trainees or subordinates, whether they be his own children or his interns, disobeying him. She says, I never saw any of my father's trainees express an opinion that differed from his. In a campus class, I'll talk about my own experiences because I've had so many bosses. But one in particular, when I first got started out after college, was a kind of tyrant because she wanted basically yes men and yes women around her. And if you know that expression, that means that we were there to repeat back to her things she already thought were true without any question. So we were cheering her on almost all the time. Yes, of course, we would say. But that's not how the world works typically, or successfully, I'll say, because, and she did have her moments of unsuccessfulness. In both Ellen Owens Johnson and in other cases, having only a tyrant's viewpoint doesn't get you to where you need to be. You want to be expansive with how you're thinking about viewpoints and how you're researching them. Not to discount them immediately, but to also be looking for viewpoints that you can learn from. It seems self-evident, but a lot of students shy away from that. I don't know why. We avoid the tyranny of one viewpoint. You might notice that that's Ellen Owens Johnson. She has yes men and yes women who surround her, father. And then we get this other reading, among the many readings in the book. There's this other one, if I can call it up here. That's just before it. From an educator who spent her early life educating people and then imposing tests because we wanted to test and find out where students were. Well, the problem with that is that, as you know, you're the most tested generation ever. Your generation and the students preceding you have been tested almost to the death because there's so many tests that you've had to undergo. And she's actually changed her mind, if you notice, because she's switched her viewpoint after discovering what tests do and how tests don't always measure intelligence like we'd like. There's some problems with just testing. She's one of these people, Diane Ravitch, who discover a part of the way along that she can change her mind and talk about a change of viewpoint. So viewpoints we encounter don't just have to do with the viewpoints we meet in our research and totally different people, but we can actually grow as we get older and discover things. And we should really look for that, especially if we get more information. Does it make her more or less authoritative? We'd argue in college, typically, if someone learns something and grows, that they are more authoritative, or a word that we'll use very soon is ethos. It builds credibility. It makes you more authoritative if you've really been there and done that and seen what there is to see. Many of our readings try to emphasize the rejection of just one viewpoint and the tyranny that is accompanying that one viewpoint, and growing towards understanding more informed viewpoint. As I say down here at the bottom in my campus class, research should really lead us to discovery, something or someone we didn't know before. Discovery comes from an older meaning of a word, meaning that you literally uncover it. You take the cover off it so you can see it. So that's the spirit of how we explore different viewpoints, especially our own, as we grow. Right? I say up here on this earlier slide, or this earlier page, that our own ego can be affected. So why isn't that represented in our viewpoint? And many of the readings echo this too. Since I'm moving things around on my little board here, I'll bring it up. I have over here David Brooks, who emphasizes some of the same things in such a timely way. And what I've highlighted in this particular reading, this is hanging off the D2O website. Here's the mindset that's tearing us apart. David Brooks writes that all stereotypes that we have are wrong to some degree, but of course it's difficult to avoid them. He says, I would add, they're always hurtful. We should be more suspicious of our categories, but much quicker to acknowledge that they are sometimes helpful, but always simplistic. It would mean constantly toggling back, he says, and forth between seeing groups and seeing persons. People can be part of a group, part of that identity, but also, of course, they're specifically them. That's why there are more than 2.5 sides to every issue, really. Because we drop our stereotypes when we meet real people. As much as they are informed by the identity that shaped them, the group that they're from, who they are are specific people with specific interests and needs and viewpoints, and that's what we're searching for when we're looking for good viewpoints. I have another slide here I was going to show too. There's so many things that I'll use when talking about viewpoints, even a poem. One in particular that students respond to is one that gets used maybe too frequently at commencement speeches. And since many of my students have just been to a graduation or are going to one, I'll read this one just because it does talk about viewpoint. Many people have heard of this one, but have we really looked at it? Robert Frost's the poem The Road Not Taken is talking about a guy standing at the fork in the road, and he wonders which road to take at that fork. There's another famous half-comedian athlete, Yogi Berra, who would say, when you get to the fork in the road, take it, joking that you have to take one of those roads, but not altogether joking, because that's Robert Frost's point. He starts his poem by just describing what he's got there. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Try to determine what will happen to him if he takes that one fork in life. Not just at the road, but a decision that makes you, breaks you, gives you different experiences, the people you're hanging with, the spouse you marry, the choices in a profession that you make, everything. Right? And the thing is, you'll be standing at that fork in the road making that choice. You'll be wondering what will happen to you when you make that choice. And he thinks to himself, as he's standing at the fork in the road, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, we actually don't know, well, there's no other stanza here, we don't know what happens to him. He's only thinking at the beginning, at the point where he makes the choice. He's about to make a choice. He's thinking about, I'm going to be looking back at how I made this choice and saying this really made the difference for me. And usually in a commencement speech or graduation, that's taken in a positive way. And it's really good to take it in a positive way because you want to grow through education. But through all of our choices in life, we're going to be thinking, I could do this or this other thing. Maybe there's more than 2 roads I could take. And you're thinking to yourself, just like Frost, the viewpoint I really am thinking about is that future me looking back at this moment right now. It's a little bit like the moment in the barbershop or the beautician salon where you're standing in front of the mirrors and you're kind of looking off into infinity, where it's a little daunting because you're making a choice that will affect you. You're not sure how, and you're thinking about how you'll look back at this moment because you can't remake this decision. This is one of those decisions that's only going to get made once. In a way, this is a good echo of that viewpoint over the course of a life and how you grow during that life. And research should really allow you to have moments when you see the different viewpoints that are possible. And you see the viewpoints, even in yourself, that could grow from what your experience is. If we're not, then what are we doing? Because as we said before, education is about bringing out and leading forth, right? It doesn't mean we have to abandon everything, but it also means that we shouldn't be trapped or only adhering to one viewpoint because that's the way it's always been. Okay, so a short video on viewpoint, and the main purpose here is, yes, to pick up the vocabulary, pick up the idea of the chapter, and also to be invited toward those differing viewpoints that are out there in the world, worthy of our research, and a viewpoint that we might learn from and become interested in later, because it'll be our own viewpoint, and we'll look back on our experience and see ourselves actually growing, just like Diane Ravitch or any of these folks who understand how their viewpoint can change and grow and not just be fixed, as David Brooks points out. So there's our short video on viewpoint.